But without further ado, let's get started with costume fabrication and design, the basics. So we're going to try to go through and talk a little bit about how to design and make your own costumes. But when we're getting started with our own costumes, we have to kind of, figure out what we're trying to do. So formulate a plan whenever you're trying to make a costume. I think it's very important to start off by getting research done. You want to be able to get all of the reference material for your character that you're trying to make the costume for. Getting the back of the character and the bottom of the shoe, all of these different things that are just kind of hard to find. You want to make sure you have access to when you're trying to build out your costume. Next, I would do is kind of try to map it out, figure out what parts I'm trying to make. What do I actually need? This character's got gauntlets, they have armor, they've got a cape, try to kind of give yourself a to-do list of what all needs to be made. Then the next thing would probably be to draw it out. And by drawing it out, I mean, getting your measurements so that you can make sure that you're getting everything properly fitted to you, actually drawing the templates that you might need for your armor pieces, making sure that basically everything you have is ready to go, so that when you get started making the costume, you have a solid to-do list, a solid foundation of where you're trying to go and know what you need. Lastly, it's also making a list of materials that you are going to need when you're making your costume. Again, when we were talking about making costumes, you're not going to go out and buy cloth for armor that you're going to make. You're probably going to buy foam or something like that. You want to make sure that you have a good understanding of what you need and what local craft stores might have the items that you need. That way you can get all of your shopping done in maybe 1 or 2 goes. Once we get to a part where we're ready to go, we've got all the materials and we're all set to make the costume, it's important to also know what it is that we're going to need to make these costume pieces. Not every technique is going to be needed for particular pieces. You wouldn't use sewing for armor. If you're going to make armor, you're probably going to do more of a sculpting sort of thing. Sewing, however, would be a great technique to use if you're making your own clothing, if you're making a coat, jacket, pants, all these little fun things. Anything that requires mainly just cloth material is something I would go for with sewing. Sculpting, however, I would definitely recommend, using foam pieces that you would want to make armor out of. If you're making, gauntlets, chest plates, all that good stuff, sculpting would be the tool that you'd be looking for. Paint and makeup is something that'd be more if you're trying to make a monster design or if you're going as an alien, something that lets you move your mouth around, lets you talk and kind of, keep your face still there while you're working with the costume. Casting and molding and 3D printing, I would actually recommend these techniques more for people who are looking to sell parts for costumes. If they're wanting to make, a lot in one go, like casting and molding, you can make about, after you've made the first mold, you can make about 50 or so pieces in one sitting. So, if you're someone who's interested in selling costume pieces, casting and molding would be the way to go. If it's something for personal, I would recommend just maybe going to sculpting, possibly 3D printing, but we'll get more into that as we go along. Sculpting is the basic go-to when working with costumes. A lot of people, when they work, they'll always go to Ava foam as the main source. However, I always want to recommend, if you're going to work with Ava foam, to be aware that it is a lot of upfront costs to it. It is the more expensive sculpting form because you need to also buy, tools to go with it, Dremels, heat guns, glue, cutting knives, all this good stuff that would help you, make the costume the best you can possibly make it. So what I actually recommend for people who are just starting out is things like styrofoam, paper mache, and tape and cardboard as alternatives. Styrofoam is something that comes usually free with, if you ever buy a box and you have, they have styrofoam packaging in there. They also sell styrofoam at local craft stores and art supply shops by the block, depending on where you go. The only thing I recommend though with styrofoam is that it is kind of troublesome to sculpt with, being that it is something you can't just take a knife to and cut away at. You actually have to buy a specific tool called a heat wire that basically heats the styrofoam up and kind of melts it away as you sculpt. Paper mache, this is pretty simple. It's actually the cheapest of the alternatives we have here. Paper mache is just, newspaper, paper towels with a little bit of water, glue, and flour. Easy to start with. I usually used to, when I was first doing masks or doing helmets and things like that, I would get a balloon, just blow it up, and then, put paper mache over it. And there you go. You had a mask, and you would just paint it afterwards. It's very simple, straightforward. Tape and cardboard. Everyone gets cardboard lying around somewhere. You can get it from, cereal boxes, from packages that you get from the mail. It's also a pretty good starting point as well. Cardboard as well is very durable, surprisingly. So if you don't have to worry about it being damaged. The actual piece that we're going to be doing later today for our demo was originally designed to be made out of cardboard, but we're going to be using Ava foam today, so you all can get a chance to get with an experience or some hands-on look at how Ava foam actually works. The next method of making costumes is paint and makeup. Now, I'm not really an expert with paint, makeup, and all that good stuff. There are a lot of really cool videos online that you can find that will go more in depth on these tutorials. I usually think about monster makeup or like those old sci-fi channel shows where they have, like silicone, they make molds out of the person that's going to be wearing the makeup, and then make these like polyurethane plastic that they attach with like, different kinds of glues and all that stuff to make them look otherworldly. Again, I would highly recommend going online, finding some more tutorials on these. They actually have a lot of in-depth ways of going about this. I know a lot of people also like to use makeup for crossplay, being able to kind of, really fit the role of the character that they're trying to go for, getting fake beards, wigs, all this good stuff in order to really create the illusion of that they have become this character. Makeup can also be good for tattoos as well as battle damage, like, character scars, or if you wanted to do someone who is like, I know for Dragon Ball or Dragon Ball Z cosplays, a lot of people like to do the fake blood after they've been, in the middle of a fight or something like that. Or you can use makeup as well on armor to make it look a bit more tarnished, as well as, have all of the bullet holes or all this cool stuff that you can do with makeup and paint. Before we move on to casting and molding, this is a little bit complicated. Were there any questions about the previous ones we had talked about?
There are no questions in the chat.
All right, great. Yeah, casting and molding is a bit more complicated, and we talked about it a little bit at the beginning, being more towards, if you wanted to mass produce something. Now, the important thing to note too as well is casting and molding are slightly different in what they do and how they go about making armor pieces. Casting is a form of basically where you, a form of sculpting where you put layers upon layers on top of it where it retains the original form. Usually you can think of like with plaster or things like that. Molding, however, is something that leaves behind a empty form, which is pictured here in this photo we have of a helmet that has been made using a two-part mold. Now, two-part molds are the usual way to go about working with molding, at least for me. The helmets, smaller pieces, you want to kind of work with casting and molding in that regard, because we're going to, as I explain here in a sec, the type of molding that you want to do requires you to kind of shake it around and work with it. The type of molding that is referred to is slush molding. Now, with your two-part mold, you want to make the outer side of the mold out of like a hard, like, fiberglass. It can be made out of just something that's just really hard that can retain the shape and be clamped down. On the inside, however, which is the flexible part of the flex seal, is made out of a polyurethane kind of rubber material that's basically goes over the top of our original design here, in this case, helmet. Then once it dries, we take it apart, and now we have our mold and ready to go. When you're ready to make the mold, you're going to be working in what is called two-part plastic. This two-part plastic is a very toxic chemical. And now I want to make sure that you understand, if you're going to be using casting and molding, that you're going to need a garage or a place that's very well ventilated, as well as you're going to have to wear a mask, goggles, gloves, all of these sorts of things. And when I say mask, I mean the ones that have an actual ventilator in it, not just something that is, just something you would wear out to the grocery store. The masks do need to be able to filter air because these chemicals are toxic. So this is why I would always say that casting molding, while it is an option available to people to work in costuming, they need to understand that this is a, dangerous sort of thing to be working with. So just be mindful while you're working with this. So the two-part plastic, you're going to pour together into the mold that you have now made, and you're going to kind of shake it around that way until it covers the entirety of the flex mold on the inside. You'll continue doing this until you've run about like 3 to 4 layers of plastic, because again, you want to make sure it's going to be hard and be able to take damage or anything like that if you're going to be traveling with it and things of that nature. But once it's dried out, you can actually take it off, and the flex part will actually peel away from it, and you'll have a lovely helmet, chest plate, or whatever it is you've made using this slush mold here. One thing to think about too is with casting, we're going to move on to casting here. I've noted that plaster is a great way to cast things. There is also another tool called resin. Resin is similar to the two-part plastic chemicals that were mentioned previously. Resin, however, is a bit different in the sense of, while yes, you're going to be mixing two parts together, resin, when it starts to harden, it gets extremely hot. So when you're working in a slush mold, when you're wanting to make layers and things like that, the resin needs to be, each time you put it on top of it, you need to put about 1/3 each time. Basically, because if you do it, 1 for 1, you'll actually melt the resin that is already dried underneath it because it's just that hot. I can't count the number of times I've messed up costume pieces that were made from resin because I just didn't put the right ratios in each time. So again, I recommend that this one for more advanced people, as well as more people willing to be in the selling of the parts rather as opposed to wearing them themselves. Lastly, we have 3D printing. 3D printing is basically the new kid on the block. It's been very helpful in making more detailed costumes, more detailed armor, all these cool different nooks and crannies you can get in there because of computer technologies that allow you to model and make your own materials. We've got some modeling programs listed here, Fusion 360, Blender, and Maya, all of which you can use to make very good 3D objects and things like that. There are some free ones, however, that you can use. I just kind of prefer these ones because the materials that they have to work with, as well as all of the sculpting tools, are a bit more, advanced. They have a lot of cool things you can do, whereas the free alternatives, just like Tinkercad, all that good stuff, not as much. They can get basic shapes and that's about it. With 3D printing, however, there are some things that you need to know when you're working with 3D printing for a costume piece. 3D printing works with a plastic polymer. You want to make sure that that plastic polymer is something that is both skin safe and water safe, because the 3D printing filaments, specifically at the Harrington Library, is called ABS. ABS filament, when it gets hot, when it gets wet, it basically leaves a chemical that comes off of it that is toxic to you. So when you're wearing a helmet or any sort of piece and it's rubbing against your skin, and it's also, it's Texas, it's hot, you're going to sweat in your costume. When it gets to a point where it's, rubbing against your skin, all of the chemicals are starting to rub against your body, it's just not good for you. It's actually toxic. It is something that you should be very aware of, that when you go to some place that offers 3D printing, you should ask, is this ABS filament? If they say yes, you want to do something different. Now, if you want to, however, you can buy your own 3D printer and buy your own filaments. Again, like with AvaFoam, like with the molding and casting, there is a lot of upfront costs. But if you feel it's going to be something you're going to be using a lot of, or if it's something that you feel that you might want to make a living off of at some point, I always recommend, understanding your upfront costs. Now, one last thing to think about too, when it comes to 3D printing, is what pieces should be printed on the 3D printer for a costume. The thing you need to understand is that 3D printing plastic is hard and it's also brittle. That plastic should not be put onto any load-bearing pieces in your costume, such as, shoes, anything on the ankles or on the knees, your, shoulder pads, where your elbows are at. Basically, any joints are where you should not put 3D printed materials for your costume. Now, 3D printing is great, however, for, helmets, for chest plates, for props even. So if you have any props or any items that you're interested in, that would be something that 3D printing can do. Now, lastly, but not exactly super important, but it is the cool part of costuming and design. And that's adding lighting to your costume. I can't count the number of times wherever I've seen a cool cosplay and then they're like, hey, watch this. And then they press a button and all of a sudden the suit lights up and it's doing some crazy things. They have like, the cannon and it starts lighting up and making noise that goes along with it. And that's just really cool. Like, it's not necessary for your cosplay, but it's just that little extra step that makes everything all the more worth it whenever you get that crazy reaction from a fan or someone who wants to take a photo of you. You can actually get lights pretty easily at hardware stores or at basic other lighting companies that are local to the area. The types of lights that most people work with are LED based. There are strip lights, EL wire, as well as fairy lights, all of which that can make, lines around it and be programmed to turn on whether or not you want to, have it related to sound or something that, you press a button and then it just, turns on there. There's very varying degrees of programming, both simple and complex. I highly recommend going on and finding some online tutorials for that in your spare time, because there's a lot of cool, intricate ways that you can kind of hide the wire into the costume, as well as putting it into like the helmet area and all that good stuff. Before we move on, are there any questions that I can answer? All right. So before we get started with our demo, we're going to roll over with a different camera here, but we've got some characters here as well as a poll for y'all. Now, these characters are known to be very powerful superheroes with vision that can spot an enemy miles away. But can you actually guess where the actors here see out of? So we're going to have a poll going while we get switched on over to our actual demo. So have fun. We'll see you in a sec. All right. Are we good? Okay. Take this out here real quick then. So we've got our demo here ready to go. As you can see, I've got some paper here that has already been pre-cut into the patterns that we need for our helmet. This process is called Pepakura. Basically what it is it takes the 3D model and cuts it into, reasonable sized paper strips that you can work with and cut out and then use as templates for cutting through your Ava foam. Now, I've already pre-cut some, as well as already kind of put some together, since these are, a bit tedious to work with. But as you can see here, we now have some Ava foam that's already ready to cut. One last thing to note is this is a pretty thick piece of Ava foam. This is probably about as thick as I recommend working with. It's about a 1/4 inch thick. Anything thicker is a little bit harder to work with. It also is just bulky and it just doesn't produce anything that I think looks good. But it's up to you. If it's your piece, and you can probably, if you get a thicker one, you can probably sculpt more with it using knives and Dremels, things like that. But this is what I'm working with. So keep this off here. All right. So now we've got our pieces ready to go. You'll note here as well, it's kind of a little cut, a little jagged here and there. Like there's some parts that I kind of messed up while I was cutting. Don't worry about that. What we're going to do is once we finish gluing everything together, we're going to actually start to sculpt it so that way it makes a more uniform shape. We'll be using sandpaper, we're going to be using actual extra foam clay, things like that. So again, if it's a little jagged, no need to worry. So as you can see here, this piece is already glued together. And it's also a bit more shapen, if you can tell. It's a bit more curved and things like that. That's thanks to not only just me doing this constantly to kind of keep it and shape it, because Avafoam is nice because it will actually bend to the heat that just generated from your hands. However, you do need to get it particularly hotter in order for it to be able to glue down properly. So what I'm using here is rubber cement. You can get this at any local hardware store, any craft store probably too. Yes, lovely smell of rubber cement. Usually whenever I'm working with a piece of foam, it's important to have what is called a heat gun. Now this gun basically is meant to blow hot air, kind of like a hairdryer would, but at much higher temperatures. That way it'll actually start to melt the Avafoam as well as make it easier for you to curve and then put together. Now, I'm going to ask that those who are watching this wearing headphones, that you might want to turn it down just a little bit, because this does tend to get a little loud. So give you a few seconds here. 1, 2, 3. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go up top here and kind of just blow this. So it starts getting hot. And you want to constantly keep it moving. As you can see, now it's a little bit easier to bend, easier to move, as such. Now, I also want to get, before I put this part here, as you'll notice, I have little lines here. These are registration lines. These help me whenever I'm taking the pieces back together to know that this line here needs to connect here so that when it gets put together, it'll be easier for me to work with. So I'm actually going to do this part first here. So I'm going to turn this back on again. And one of the things you might not be able to see just because of the way the lighting is, but what I can tell is that it's getting hot enough because it's a little lighter than the actual black part that is here, because of the fact that while it's heating it up, it's starting to close up the pores that are in there. Because Avafoam is very porous, as well as styrofoam, where it might feel like it is, solid. It's actually got a lot of holes in it. That's why when we go to paint this, we're going to need to make sure that it's got a coating over it, which we'll get to in a sec, that keeps it actually flat and solid. So you can see I'm going to push these together, and it's still giving me a little bit of give. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold it together at the end here, and we're going to use this to dry the glue. So just be careful with your hands here. It's probably better to wear gloves, but as this does get pretty hot. There. As you can see, it's starting to glue together. Usually whenever I do a piece like this one, it's important to kind of like start getting everything glued together. So after this part is done, I'll put this together and then I'll attach it to this part. And basically this part also too, I'll probably do real quick. But as you can see here, it's important when you're working with the stuff to kind of go back and forth. That way you can have things dry while you're getting ready for the next part. So we're gonna do this one real quick. You'll also note here, I'm not using the brush. I'm actually using a scrap piece of foam because the brush does not really get into the nooks and crannies that I want it to, as the little piece of Ava foam here does. Again, you also, with the brush, it's a really large piece here, so it's gonna just get everywhere. So I'll show you, it's just, it just kind of leaves a mess. So I like to use the small piece of scrap foam. So we're gonna turn this on again. All right, put that together. Yeah, as you can see, there's just like huge lumps in there of glue. There we go. Stick it there. There. And there you go. And we're gonna let that dry as we move on to this small piece here. As you can see here, this is still a little wet. I'm gonna take a moment here to help it dry with the gun. You also kind of want to, as we're working with it, trying to bend it a bit more, because as you'll note, this piece is supposed to go like so around it. So we need to make sure that this is as flexible as possible. So we're gonna go back into here again. You don't need a lot, you just need a little bit. A little bit of glue goes a long way. Same thing. You'll also probably note here that I've put some paper towels down. If you're working at home and you're working on your parents' nice table, they would very much appreciate if you put some paper down. So that way you don't get this rubber cement or any of the other glues that we're going to be working with on their very nice table that they eat from. So be courteous when you're working with tools such as this. All right. As you can see, we've got a lovely curved piece ready to go. Ready to be attached. There we are. What we're going to do here is I'm going to start from the top and work my way down. So I'm going to put glue onto both sides here. There we go. Make sure to heat this up. And we're going to put it right here. And we're not really in a hurry, so go at your own pace. Take your time. You want to make sure that these things line up as correctly as possible. Again, don't worry too much about it though, because we're going to go over any things that look wrong with sandpaper, as well as some other craft glue here. Look at that. Almost there. So the next step is add glue here. All right. And once again, we're going to heat it up so that way it bends and just nice and easy. We're going to start. This is the hard part here. So as you can see, it has to curve quite a bit to get it to work here. As you can see here at 2, it's already kind of coming apart here. Again, don't worry about this. We're going to fix this later. What I am going to do is I'm going to heat it up though, so that way the glue dries. Push these together a bit more. This also helps too, because now that the foam is more malleable, it will stay where it wants to. Then once it dries, it'll dry nice and hard and look kind of like this little guy right here. As you can tell, it's probably not going to fit my head because my head's huge and this thing is tiny. But if you'll note here on this other piece that, here, there are still some areas that have little cracks in them and they don't look as smooth as they could be. There are actual foam clays you can buy that are like, name brand, things like that. However, you can, if you want to save money like I do, you can actually just get basic Crayola Model Magic foam clay. It doesn't actually even have to be the same color as what you're working with, because again, we're going to paint over this. I just like to keep it the same. So you can just take a little chunk, too much. What we're going to do is we're going to kind of put it in where those holes are at. Put it around. Again, don't worry too much about it now being lumpy, because again, we're going to go take sandpaper to this when it's right, nice and dry. And ready to go. As you can see, there's a little hole here, so we want to fill that up. There we go. Right there as well. Yeah, fill up those little cracks there. Because again, you can always take away from it. It's always just a little hard to add on. So, I usually like to roll it up into like a little snake here, and then kind of just poke in there. There. Something along the lines of that is how it'll look for now. We'll come back to this eventually, not for today's demonstration, but basically what you'll do is you'll come back with some sandpaper, just any kind you can find around the house or at a hardware store, and then basically go over top, smooth it out with some sandpaper. And then what we'll do next is we're going to seal it. Put this away here. So in order to make sure that a piece of Ava foam is ready to be painted, it needs a coat of a sealant of some kind. I personally use Mod Podge in order to seal off my costume pieces. It's relatively cheap. You can find it at any local craft store. It's basically a glue that you use to cover and coat things that need a finish of some kind. I've actually done half of this mask here, so you can kind of get a look. This is the untreated foam. You can still see it's kind of porous, as well as, you know, a little on the darker side. So whereas with the other side here with the Mod Podge, that has been coated over it, and this is just one coat. Usually I do try to do 2 to 3 coats. One, just to make sure that there are no parts I missed. 2, it also thickens it a little bit. It also makes it a little harder. So that way it's a bit more sturdy, a little easier, harder to damage. So what I usually do with this is you can just get any cheapo brush that, you know, many of these disposable kind. Take off this. And again, make sure your table is properly covered. Don't want to get any of this on the table there. Take just a little bit, you know, make some happy little brush strokes on our piece. Kind of, you know, be liberal with it. You know, it doesn't really matter how little or how much you put on. I always think a little on this one, a bit in the sense of more is less in this case, just because of the fact you're going to need to be doing multiple coats anyway. So you should probably try to do yourself a favor and put on as much as possible in that first coat. And then as you go from that first coat on, just put a little bit less and less as you go on. As you can see here, as it's starting to dry, you can still see that there's some bubbles here. That's the areas that are still porous, even after your first coat. Now, make sure you get all on there. Get every nook and cranny as well. As best you can, at least. And there you go. And once it's dry, and once you've gotten your 3 coats on here, it'll be ready to paint. And you can paint using just basic acrylic paints. You don't have to, you know, get anything too fancy. You can get the basic ones you find at the craft store that are in little tubs, things like that. You know, cheapo brand stuff. You don't have to do anything too crazy. A lot of costume designers will use airbrush, just because of the fact that airbrush doesn't leave behind any streaks or anything like that. Even with the foam brush like this, you can still see that there are streak marks in it from the directions that we've gone with our brush here. So airbrush is an alternative, but for me, who just does this as a little bit of a hobby, I like to just use a normal acrylic paint. What's nice though, too, is that since we've got this Mod Podge that's pulled over the top of it, we can also get spray paint as well to just do a quick coat for a base. And we don't have to worry about the foam being eaten and destroyed by the aerosol that's in the can. Same thing with styrofoam too. I actually had a wonderful costume that I had worked very hard on made of styrofoam. And I didn't know about the fact that the aerosol would eat away at the styrofoam. And I spray painted it without any, you know, coating like this. And all my hard work, well, it's no longer with us now. So cannot stress enough that you need to do this coating of Mod Podge. Now, I have done it on the inside as well. You don't have to. I personally like to do that just because of the fact that it is making sure that you're, you know, strong on both sides, not as opposed to just putting all the weight on one side. I don't recommend, you don't really need more than 1 or 2 coats on the inside, but it's up to you. But with that, once it's dry, painted, it's ready to wear. Now, can you guys guess if I can see you or not? Because I actually can see you. Can you guess where I'm seeing you from? I'll give you guys a couple of minutes before I tell you where I'm seeing you from, because it gets right back into our poll on where our characters see from. All right. If you guessed this little tiny hole right here, you'd be correct. This is how most suit actors actually see. They see a tiny little holes in random spots on the mask or the armor or whatever it is they have to wear in order to see. Most of the time, they actually don't see it all. So we'll turn it on over to show you the answer there. So we'll get switched on over real quick. All right, can everyone see my screen here? Yeah, okay. So it seems that the poll, everyone said through their eyes, of course. Well, to answer your question, to answer your answers, if I can just, they actually can't see very well. They do technically see through their eyes, and yes, you're technically correct, the best kind of correct. But each one of them actually has different places where they're supposed to see out of, but they actually, most of the time, cannot. The only time that they're actually able to see out of their eyes, the holes of their costume, is during stunts. Whenever they do close-ups of the characters, or if it's just, you know, a scene of them just kind of walking around or something like that, they actually cannot see at all. As you can see here in these ones, we have our character Kamen Rider to the left. He has these little tiny slits that he sees out from under his red eyes. Godzilla here sees through the collarbone, and Ultraman off to the far right sees through these tiny little dots that are shown there. But these are actually more for their stunt outfits as opposed to their normal ones. So we do have some resources here available for y'all. We have some books that are actually in the library that you can check out today if you wanted to. Feel free to go over to planolibrary.org, go to our catalog, and you can actually find these books here, get them on hold and have them shipped over to your local library. I've also got 3 specific websites that I usually go to whenever I'm looking for tutorials, as well as for just basic advice on what props to get. Kamui Cosplay has a lot of great tutorial videos. They have their own YouTube channel as well. They are a phenomenal source for, you know, getting good props, as well as for Ava foam specifically. Punished Props is, as it says, it's more for the props as well as designing your, you know, items that you're going to be carrying with you. And Uncle Hulk is a website that specializes in getting cloth material, specifically if you're wearing suits like jumpsuits, things like that, that are meant for like more, you know, superhero style outfits. All of these are really great resources for you. Other than that, we have just enough time for a little short Q&A. If you have any questions you'd like to ask, feel free to ask them now.
We do have a question. Would you mind reminding everyone where they can buy them?
Okay. Ava foam actually is now purchasable in stores at Joann's. It is through the Yaya Han brand, sorry. So it is a little overpriced. However, there are other places you can get small sheets of Ava foam from a local craft store, such as, you know, like Michael's, Hobby Lobby, things like that. And they're not thick like the ones I was working with. Those ones you probably have a better luck finding online. In fact, those websites that I had just recommended to you, all 3 of them have links to find and buy Ava foam from them. They're local companies too, so you'd be supporting a local business if you're more interested in that front.
Looks like that are all the questions that we have in the Q&A.
Okay. Yeah. Can't think of anything else that we haven't covered. I guess I would like to say thank you very much for joining us. We're going to be trying to do more of these programs in person as time goes on. We actually have another version of this costuming program happening in, I believe, October, so right around the time for Halloween. So we'll be doing that also in person as well. So if you want to actually come in and actually not only watch a hands-on demo, but actually get hands-on experience yourself, mark your calendars for sometime in October for when we'll be doing this program again. Other than that, thank you all for joining us.